This morning's panel is going to look at grit and apply that concept to organizations and communities that have overcome terrible tragedies. On December 14th, 2012, a lone gunman forced his way into Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. He killed 20 children, ranging in ages of 6 and 7. In addition, he killed 6 teachers, including the principal of the school. Prior to that, he shot his own mother and killed her in their own home. So how does a community survive something so terrible, such a dramatic tragedy like this? And how do they find the grit not only to get through the immediate disaster, but to move forward into the future? So we're going to explore that with a distinguished panel of speakers who lived through that. We're honored today to have with us 3 community leaders who are at the heart of Newtown's response to the tragedy. First, I'd like to introduce Miss Pat Lodra, former first select woman. Select woman is a term they use for mayor up in New England. Please welcome Pat to our stage. Our next guest is Monsignor Robert Weiss, who is pastor of St. Rose of Lima Roman Catholic Parish. Father. And our final panelist today is Miss Nancy Crevier, current editor of the Newtown Bee, the local newspaper. Thank you very much. So panelists, I know this is, we're about 6 years past the event, and we want to talk a little bit about the event, but we want to focus on your community's resilience and how to do this. So I'd like to start out with a question to Nancy, perhaps. Tell us a little bit about Newtown. What about the community? What's the greatest thing about it? And kind of set the stage for us, maybe thinking about the day before this disaster.
Hi, thank you for having me today. Newtown is a wonderful community. It's a family-oriented community. At the newspaper, we know that many people pick up our weekly newspaper because of the education section and because of the sports section. I don't believe there's another community newspaper in the area that covers these things as extensively as our paper does because of the great interest. We are the kind of town, and have always been the kind of town since I've lived there, which is 24 years, so generous, so giving, so concerned about each other. So to me, it was not so surprising, the response that we had to this unforeseeable disaster in our town. I was not the editor at the time of the shootings. At the time, I was the features reporter at the Newtown Bee, a very different sort of thing. But the editor at the time wrote a beautiful editorial, and I just want to share with you something because I think it says a lot about what our town was and is to this day. Part of what he wrote was about the inundation of the national news coming to our town. And he said, what they found when they got to town, however, was not a town in pieces, but a community already coming together with friends, neighbors, and mere acquaintances gathering around those most grievously wounded and supporting each other, as this town have always done. I think that says so much about what our town is. We're a beautiful town. I'm sure you saw it described on the news many, many times since then, or perhaps you've read about it. Some of you are way too young to remember that actual day. But it's a New England sort of town where there's churches on the main street and old homes from 1700s, 1800s lining the main street. It's the kind of main street where on Wednesday, 2,000 to 3,000 children are going to be visiting the homes on Main Street. Now, we're only a town of about 27,000 people. Costumed, having a great time. It's not a town event, it's just something that happened. And Main Street residents welcome these children. We have a huge Labor Day parade. Lasts, some people think, too long. It can go over 2 hours. We have a holiday festival every December. We have an arts festival. We celebrate Newtown now on Newtown Day. Parks and Rec. We have natural beauty throughout our town, a lot of rural areas, a lot of hiking trails. The open space is very important to the people in our town. It is the kind of town where people have always supported each other and continued to do so through this tragedy and beyond. And I think it's a big part of why we have been able to get through this as we have.
So I would I would add a little bit to that. I moved to Newtown with my husband and then 3 little children 48 years ago. We selected Newtown because of its school system and because of the emphasis that the community placed on families and kids and education and sports and activities and the kind of place that we knew that we wanted to stay and raise our children. I'm very happy that we made that choice, and we continue to make that choice every year as we age out. Hopefully we'll age out all the way to the end, living in the house we've always lived in Newtown. But I think it's important also to mention that one of the strengths of our community also is the religious community. And that's one of the elements I believe was so impactful in helping our community demonstrate its capacity and live out its capacity to recover from a horrible event such as we experienced on December 14, 2012. The extent of that impact is something that I hope we're able to share with you today and also help you understand a little bit how a community has grit and what that looks like, what community grit looks like, and how a community made up of then 27,000, I think it's 28,000 now, was able to individually and collectively represent that grit in their daily behaviors and in their choices to say that, yes, we have a future, and no, we won't be defined by this horrible tragedy. We will learn from it. We will incorporate it into who we are. It becomes part of our history. We will never forget it. We will always honor those young children that were killed that day and those 6 brave adults. But the tragedy won't define us. We didn't cause it. We didn't create it. It's not something we did that made it happen to Newtown. It's a complicated and complex issue that we continue to struggle with, as does the rest of the world. Wherever there's a tragedy, the understanding of the why is something that we pursue all the time. But there's a specialness about a community that has the kind of grit that Newtown has, and I hope we're able to share some of that with you this morning.
I think when you see that banner, faith, family, friends, that is, in fact, Newtown. As Pat said, the church is very much the center where people gathered during this tragedy. Those are the doors that were open 24/7. And I think, too, many of the people who relocate to Newtown are there independently. They don't have extended family, and so friendships become an important bonding for them. And I think it's because of that there was so much strength and so much support for all of us going through this. So when you look at that banner, think of Newtown, because that's truly who we are: faith, family, and friends.
I would want to add one other piece too, and why it's important for you as young people to learn the lessons from experiences of our community and other places where tragedies have occurred, and that as you each individually pursue leadership functions in your own life, and I'm certain you will all have those opportunities, you need to know those lessons, how you can anticipate that you're going to be challenged to lead organizations or communities through horrible tragedies, what it is that you need to know and be able to do, what it looks like, what survivorship looks like, what health and hope looks like, and how you can make that a reality among whatever group it is that you are leading.
I'm going to add a little bit to that too. I think that one of the things that you'll need to know is about the ability of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when you don't expect a challenge. And that was one of the things that we faced as a community newspaper, a weekly community newspaper, confronted on a Friday after our paper had already gone to press for that week as to what do our readers need from us. It's certainly nothing we had prepared for, except that we were prepared as reporters and we were prepared under good leadership and always asking ourselves with every step we took, what is our task? What do we need to give to the readers, and how can we best do that?
So all three of you have painted a great picture of Newtown as a tight community, a strong community, at peace with themselves, going about their everyday business, concerned about faith, family, and friends. So I'd like to take you to the day of this tragedy, and I want to get into some issues about leadership. So I'd like to start with Pat. As the first select woman, certainly nothing like this was probably ever on your mind, but can you kind of take us through, before you got news of the incident, what did you plan for the day? What was that day going to be like?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm a retired educator, so most of my career I was a high school math teacher, a little bit of teaching at the college level, regional principal, superintendent level. So I came to the position of first selectman in Newtown as something that I was going to do in my retirement years. I was happy to retire from my educational profession and wanted to continue to contribute as much as I could, but make that focus of contribution our community of Newtown. So on that particular day leading up to the event of the tragedy, it was a typical Friday. It was holiday season. We were in a very celebratory mood. We were preparing for our employee holiday gathering. Our Christmas party was going to be later that day. So at 9:30 in the morning, I received a call from our local dispatch alerting me that there was an emergency in town, that I was to do a code red for the building. So that meant I was to close down the municipal center because it was anticipated that there was some kind of a threat. So I did so, alerted the superintendent, whose office was across the hall, the school superintendent, and that process then began. So I then left my office and went to the police station, to the dispatch area, to see if I could figure out what was the emergency that was being talked about. And then I started to hear the calls coming in from Sandy Hook School, teachers that were calling in on their cell phones, alerting that there was an active shooter. Certainly the police were already engaged at that point. The police were already on site. So I then went to the school, to the site of the tragedy, and was there at the Sandy Hook School while the active shooter investigation was still going on, and then spent the rest of the day, of course, with families and with other, the governor and other folks came to help at the at the firehouse. We gathered at the firehouse to then do some of what the video talked about, which is the reuniting of children with their families, with their parents, and then the identification of those and the isolation of parents who were not going to be reunited with their children because their children had been killed. So that is what that day, that was the next couple of hours after the event at 9:35. The entire event, I believe, took 6 minutes for this young man to shoot his way through the glass front of the building. I want to point out that, you know, that the Sandy Hook School is a school that did everything right, had done active shooter protocols, had all the latest safety measures in place. You couldn't enter the school without being allowed in. So there was a buzzer system. The doors were locked. Everything was, it was the most rigorous application of safety procedures that you could imagine at that time. No one ever, this is a school that was built in the 50s, and it's typical of construction of schools at that time, glass fronted. Most of the schools built in that period of time had that same look, you know, the glass fronted building. So no one anticipated, of course, that someone with an AR rifle would be able to shoot their way through that glass, and that's how the killer got in the building. Shot his way through the glass front of the building. Was never allowed in. He shot his way in. So it's important that that be understood, that this is not a school that invited disaster by not being careful. This was a school that had done all the right things. And when families, you know, had their children mount a school bus that morning to take them to the Sandy Hook School, there could never be anticipated that that is where an event of this magnitude, of this horror, would ever take place.
You know, I was in the attic putting tags on Christmas gifts, and I got a phone call on my cell phone from the custodian. It said, "Father Bob, I think you really better go down to Sandy Hook School." A very high percentage of Newtown are Roman Catholics, so they're members of our parish. And many of these children had attended our St. Rose preschool program, so they weren't strangers to us. So I went immediately down, and one of the state police officers took me by the arm and escorted me to the school and said, "Father, I think you better go in and start blessing." And I walked down to the front of that school, and I still can hear the sound of that broken glass under my foot, but I saw, to be quite honest, a river of blood just coming down the hallway. And I said to myself, "They're with Jesus. I have to go back in that firehouse and be with those kids who were wondering what was going to happen." I specifically remember a little girl had her finger in the back, my belt loop. She was so conflicted whether to go home or to wait for her friends. And it was so much confusion in that firehouse. And then, as Pat said, we were escorted into another room where those parents' children were not there. And just to be in that room for hours and hours and hours, the emotion, the cell phone, the panic. There were thoughts that these children had run to the police station, were hiding in the woods. There were still thoughts that there were other shooters in the area. There was just a tremendous amount of confusion. But I remember the governor saying to me, "Father, I think it's time, and isn't it appropriate on a Friday at 3 o'clock, I have to tell these parents that their child died just like Jesus?" And he walked in and told the families. And I spent the rest of the day with families. I went back to church. We had an incredible service at our church that night, over 2,000 people, inside, outside. It was one of those Christmas card things where the doors and windows were open and people were peering in. People had no place else to go but to be together. And from there, I went out with the police to assure these families that, in fact, their child had died. I will say one of the most important moments was when I came home around 2 in the morning. There were 2 vans parked in the parking lot. I was very nervous because we had posters for people to write messages on. And when I came back, it was scribbled across, "It's not over yet." And I didn't know what to assume when I saw these 2 vans in the parking lot. And I walked in, and there were two rows of young college students who had just come home praying the rosary. I still get, choked up from this. You know, I was brought into a very intimate part of this tragedy, having to deal directly with families and helping to plan 10 funerals. And it was an amazing experience to have to enter into that process. And you may have heard that shortly after this, not even 48 hours, our church had a threat put against it. We had a phone call from a young man that said, "I'm Adam's best friend, and you're the next target, and I'm coming to do what he wanted done." From that moment on, our church was never without SWAT teams and dogs and police cars. It was an unbelievable experience as we went through the funerals of these children.
So one of the messages that I'm hoping that we can communicate, I mean, you need to understand our emotion, and I think that you do. You understand how impacted each of us have been by the horror of what happened in our community. But we don't want to leave you with only that thought that it was horrible, and in fact it was, but also understand that we all deal with circumstances in life that are so tragic, so horrific, that the struggle we have to organize our thinking around how do we manage that event and still move forward. It's the moving forward that is critically important for every community and every human that has a tragic event. It's the capacity to look on the horizon, look at that horizon and say there is a positive life out there. There is something to pursue. There's hope, and there's a future, and there's a positive possibility in each of us individually and collectively, and we have to harness that. Because if we do not, then we all become victims of our own tragedy. So it's understanding that as leaders that's really important to do. And if for each of you, as you grow into those experiences, understand that as well. That your heart is going to be full of grief and sorrow over the sadness that you've confronted. And it's important to always have that emotion, always feel that hurt that makes you human, that makes you real. But it's also important to bring your head to those events and say it's not enough just to be responding. I also have to be leading in a recovery. I have to know what recovery looks like. I have to have the capacity to make it happen, to help it happen. And I have to have the courage, I have to have the spine to make some tough decisions going forward, because if I do not as the leader, then I run the risk of being stuck in where I am.
I think that's very true. I think that, it's a decision on what you're going to do with the information that you have, and that's particularly true when you're a newspaper. Now, the Newtown Bee goes to press on Thursdays. We're out on the street Thursday afternoon. Most people get their paper on Friday. So for us, Friday is the one day that we can go, okay, now what's next? And jump into the next week. It's a little more relaxed. Everybody's happy. On December 14th, which was a Friday, 2012, are you familiar with radio stations that sometimes say, oh, if you are the X number caller, you're going to win blah, 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 blah? Well, one of our support staff called in to one of those radio stations that day and won a free lunch for our whole office. And we were jumping up and down when suddenly we went, shh, 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 something's coming across the scanner. And when you talk about the confusion and the chaos, all we knew was a shooter was reported at our school, Sandy Hook School. So we immediately dispatched a reporter down there to see what was going on, because a shooting in town of any, at the time, the first things that we were catching were not of mass shooting. Maybe it was a domestic. We weren't really sure, but we needed to get the facts. We needed to get a reporter down there. We actually had two who ended up being down there, one for a short while, who was our photographer, captured some iconic moments before being called back to the office. And it was like so much of the nation, even being the hometown newspaper, getting the real facts bit by bit by bit was a little bit of a challenge, because it's the kind of thing that you don't really want to grasp immediately when you keep hearing not one person, not 6 people, not a dozen people. We're talking a lot of people dead, and a lot of them are children. So the decision had to be made, what do we do with this information? We knew that national media was, by the afternoon, early on, was already descending upon our town and putting out stories. And unlike the national media, our challenge was, how do we get the real facts and get the real facts out to the people of our community. Now, because we're a weekly paper, our editor at the time and the publisher talked briefly and decided that the only way to do that was to put out a special edition. It meant calling everybody in over the weekend, because we normally have just one person on the weekend, and our copy editors and our layout people, all of our support staff, our press people, because we do print our own paper. And I don't think a single person said, no, I won't come in. We put together the stories that we thought were vital to the community, the facts about what had happened. How could people deal with this? Where was there help to be found for our readers at the time? All of this went into a special edition that we put out on Monday morning, followed by our usual weekly reports on Thursday and Friday. So that was the start of determining how a small-town newspaper is going to respond to a worldwide tragedy, because within days, that's what it had become, world news.
Father, you were quoted at the time as saying, evil visited us, but we have to get through it and find some good. How did you find some good out of this situation?
You know, the whole time I was in that firehouse, not one person, not one said, why did God do this? I was amazed, because that's something that just seems to come automatically when something happens. But not one of anyone said that to me. And I think we all felt like this was an evil action, not an evil person. This was a sick young man, but this was an evil action that had overtaken us. And because it was around Christmas and the Jewish holidays, the theme of light emerged very, very quickly. And the mantra very much became that there is darkness, but light always overcomes the darkness. And that's a theme that really carried us through, I believe, these funerals, the Christmas season, the Hanukkah season, and all the celebrations. You know, a lot of people were asking, how can we do Christmas this year? How can we do it? We have to do it. There are so many other children still alive, still excited about Santa Claus coming, still excited about the birth of Christ. We had to move on. But I think because the community so quickly embraced, in fact, I don't even know where it came from, but I walked out in front of our church with this humongous banner hanging, the light was shining, the darkness was gone. And so I was so impressed with the faith of the people that recognized this not as the hand of God. And you know, shortly after the shooting over our school, someone took a picture for me of a cloud formation of a cross. And if you look really closely, you can actually see a corpus. And I thought to myself, that was the sign that God was protecting us. And a couple of months later, I started looking at that picture, and I realized, no, this is a sign of a burden that's been put on our community. And it's a cross that we have to carry, but we can carry it with pride, we can carry it with humility, we can carry it with compassion and healing. And that's been very much, you know, my role is very different from having to decide a lot of important things. My role is trying to bring consolation to some very broken families and try to maintain families and marriages in a community that's really been deeply ruptured. But I think that very much was our theme, that this was a hand of evil, this was not the hand of God.
So it is true that not every community, not every organization thrives and survives and thrives after a horrific impact. And we knew that. We understood that intuitively, that we in Newtown were facing a challenge, that somehow we had to be able to define and pursue a future of hope and be the confident, caring community that we had always been. You know, our confidence, I was interested in Secretary Bennett's reference to President Reagan this morning when he talked about one of his singular goals was to restore in America that sense of confidence in who we are. Well, I had, as the leader of Newtown, I had that same thought and that same challenge. We just could not, I would not ever feel okay in my role as the town's leader if we got stuck in that grief, if we couldn't move forward. So one of the biggest challenges that we all faced is how do we take who we are and demonstrate our capacity to move forward with this challenge and become, again, that beautiful, caring, lovely, family-oriented, school-oriented community that everyone wants to live in. So from day one, we had to sort ourselves around two initiatives. One is the response. There's some practical things that have to be done to respond to your circumstances, but there's also those challenges of recovery. And those things are the same whether you have a large tragedy such as we experienced or something smaller that would affect an organization or an individual. You respond to your circumstances, but you also then have to say, how do I move forward from this circumstance to something different? And that is the journey of Newtown. So I think it's important also to put that into some kind of context.
Pat, could you talk about on that theme of recovery? So virtually your neighboring communities first, but the whole nation responded to this incident and provided a lot of support in many ways. So take us a couple months after the incident and talk a little bit about the leadership challenges you faced in that aftermath of handling this generosity.
Well, certainly there's nothing in my life that had prepared me for anything of this magnitude. One of the things that I learned very quickly is that you have a lot of partners. There's a lot of folks that are willing and able and ready to help and need to be engaged and have the capacity to do great work in support. So from the very first day through the following months and years, I found that we had wonderful partners. One of our biggest challenges, of course, is that this event occurred in a school, at an elementary school, a week before Christmas break, knowing then that we could not use that school, we couldn't return those children to that school. So how do we address that issue? Nearly 500 youngsters were now separated from their elementary school. So neighboring communities stepped up in fact, within days, I received a text from a fellow first selectman saying, hey, we closed a school 2 years ago that you might be able to use for your students. So that began that journey that I had of relating with other kinds of government, local, state, and federal governments, nonprofits, certainly United Way, Red Cross, FEMA, federal agencies, a tremendous outpouring of support that was very welcome, overwhelming, but very welcomed, but also began to challenge us in other ways. There's an organization, by the way, that I think gets very little applause that everyone should know about, and that's an organization through the Seventh-day Adventist Church that was actually created after Katrina. They're a specialized group that goes to communities that have had tragedies, and they're logistics experts. So they immediately came to Newtown and said, you're going to be overwhelmed with donations. Let us take on that challenge. So they did, found a warehouse in town, did an intake process, organized everything, and I can tell you, partly because of the age of the victims and the time of the year, we were overwhelmed there were trailer trucks of things that were coming into our community every day, to the library, to parks and recreation, to churches, to the town. At one point, we knew because of the intake process that we had more than 650,000 stuffed animals. We had bikes and backpacks and prayer shawls and candles and books, and the national and international response was overwhelming, and there was millions of dollars that were coming in response, tremendous generosity. But all of those all that generosity also created tremendous challenges. How do you organize that? How do you manage that? How do you respect it? How do you document all of that goodness and all of that generosity? So that again created other kinds of needs for talent. So one of the lessons that I've learned is that you have great talent, local talent in your community, but you also have a business community that is willing to step in with expertise, and you have other municipal agencies and federal and state agencies. So again, an overwhelming response, overwhelming interest, again, partly because of the age of the victims and the time of year, but again, and greatly appreciated, but tremendous challenges in terms of a management issue. You know, a town like Newtown, I was it at the time. There's not a great body of government. There's one person elected to be the leader of the community, and in that one person resides the responsibility to be the executive, to do all that organizational stuff. So I guess part of the message here for leaders is to know that there's a great body of help that's available to you under all kinds of circumstances. Be aware of who they are, what service they can provide, and that's a message I always share with other municipal leaders. Know that in advance. Know who your agents are, who's in charge of those agencies, what they can do, who they are, how to contact them, what their services are, how available they are. So we didn't know any. We had no reason to know any of that. So part of the overwhelming nature of being the leader in those circumstances is how do you sort it out quickly, and how do you use people to the best of their abilities so that your community can be well served. So again, know all that stuff ahead of time is one of my messages.
I think I'm going to add to that too, is that one of the things I think that helped the Newtown B to succeed and to continue forward was the fact that we are a pretty tight team. There's only about 6 reporters and editors on our editorial staff. And, you know, this is actually a fairly large staff these days in a weekly newspaper, but we have a lot to cover. Everybody knew their job. Everybody had the ability and the skills and the background to know how to report. So that was nothing really new to us. We went forward doing our job, doing what we do, doing it a little differently, because every single person at the Newtown B was touched somehow personally by a loss. We had interviewed many of these families through school events, through Parks and Rec events, through church events, through just all of those little community events that I talked about. So there wasn't a single person on the staff who didn't have to overcome a personal feeling, because as a reporter, what we had to do was just take the facts, just present the facts to people, and put our personal views, our personal feelings. We had to overcome that. It was very hard. It's still hard to this day. I mean, I have to say that watching that little clip this morning was really hard, because we're all part of the community, and that's the thing about a weekly paper. And to have everybody just step up and say, I can do this. I know what my job is. I'm going to move beyond this, and then when I go home, I'll cry.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry.
I'm going to let Father give a response, and then I'd like to open it up
Sure.
to your questions.
I just want to say, I think, you know, when we clergy met, and we have a very unique community. We have a Baha'i community. We had a Buddhist monastery at one time. We have a Muslim community. We have all the mainline Protestant churches, and we have evangelicals as well. But in our meetings with the counselors, they really encouraged us as leaders to help families heal themselves. There was only so much the professionals could keep doing, and we were expending hundreds and thousands of dollars on professional counseling. But to really work to help restore family and marriage in your community, that's something that's really critical in these times, and it's something that I think we forget in this hurry-up world. I noticed after this there was a lot of reprioritizing in family systems. In fact, we added an additional mass to our church on a Sunday night which is now one of our most full masses. So the families had time together on Sunday morning to do the sports, to have breakfast together, just to have time together. And the other thing I just want to say is, this affected me very deeply. In fact, flying here was a great challenge for me. For the last 3 days, I've had to talk to myself constantly about my anxiety about flying, which is this post-trauma that's affected me. And I want to encourage you, when you go through these experiences, don't be too proud to get help. You're of no help to anyone else if you don't get help yourself. I know my dad came home for World War II and for years would never eat chicken, and we could never understand that. And finally, in his last years, he shared with us that, and as he was walking down the streets, the pro-Nazis would throw chickens and chicken blood at him, and he never dealt with that. He never dealt with that, as do most men that come home from war. But don't suppress it. Get the help that you need and deal with it effectively for yourself, because that's the only way you can really help others.
Questions from the audience, please.
I have a question. So it's been 6 years now, and I know the communities, you always have to move on. But how is your community, because of this event, how have you helped them move together 6 years on? Like, looking at it now, it's like the community still as tight as it was at that moment after everything happened. How have you led people to keep it as tight as it is?
I think we can each probably speak to that from a different perspective. The community, I think we're, if there's one way to talk about community health, I can say I think we're okay. I think we're doing all right. Certainly, some of the fractures that will exist because of stress are evident, and I think they were evident pretty quickly. I think you make a mistake when you try to homogenize everyone under one characteristic. People bring to every event their own baggage, and that baggage only gets set aside for a little bit of time and then reemerges. So we have to be honest and transparent in our understanding about what communities are. Newtown is made up of 27 unique individuals. I think that we are a very tight community, but we're also very honest that we don't all have the same interests or aspirations. So I think we will continue to move forward as long as we have that layer of honesty and accept that we come to issues sometimes from different perspectives, and we have to always be able and willing to hear those different voices in an open and comfortable environment, and make sure that everyone's point of view is represented in some way, or at least heard in some way. So I think that's the characteristic of our community and why it is that we continue to do all right. We typically don't use the phrase move on. We are moving forward. We will always embrace what happened to us. We need to integrate it. We need to value those lives. We don't ever want to forget that we lost 20 beautiful children and 6 adults. All of those individuals that were killed that day deserved to live. And we don't know what great things we are not going to have in this life because we lost those people. So we have to honor them. We have to know that they were important. They lived and were important. And we don't want to forget that. But at the same time, we also don't want to get stuck there. So again, I think that we are healthy because we are honest about who we are, and we are committed to a positive future. We talk that way to each other. We accept and acknowledge that we've had this horrible thing happen to us, but we also say we will not be defined by that. We will be defined by our goodness.
Yeah, I think, this just reinforced what was already there and made it stronger and made it better. It's so easy to forget everyone else's tragedies when you're so focused on this one tragedy. And We had an incident where a young man was killed by a truck just a few weeks before this, and his family actually left Newtown because they felt as if nobody really cared about them. There was so much focus on Sandy Hook. It just reminded all of us that every person every day can go through a tragedy. Losing a husband of 65 years, losing your job. You know, there's so many personal tragedies people have to deal with. And we see our community reaching out to those people more generously and more lovingly. There's also a lot of new people that have moved into the community who didn't go through this experience. And we have to be sensitive to that as well when we're trying to do our programs and our ministries, because their reason for moving Newtown was not because of Sandy Hook. You know, their reason for moving here was the kind of community that we are.
Did that answer your questions? I just wanted to add to that sensitivity has been one of the big motivations at the Newtown Bee, you know, how we approached the families, whether they wanted to be approached or not. National news was happy to leap on them. We were not happy to leap on them. And we have always left it open to them through these 6 years. When they have a story for us, when they need to say something, they know we're there for them.
How did you get through the next day?
Wow, that's a really good question. Well, the day, there was no next day. I mean, it was one continuous event for several days. So most of us didn't go home, didn't go to bed, didn't do anything other than engage and interact. So for me, the families left the firehouse. I remained to meet with state police. Eric Holder had arrived at that point. The president's advance team had come to meet with me at about 3 o'clock in the morning. It was then Saturday. The President Obama was coming to Newtown on Sunday. So, of course, there was a lot of that. That's the practical stuff that kind of says, okay, you have to deal with what's right in front of you. So it's making those arrangements and securing an environment and making sure that families that wanted to meet with the president were able, and we had a safe, comfortable place for them to meet with the president, and, you know, all of those kinds of practical things. So that was all resolved by probably about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday. And then it was meeting again with state police. Our local police had partnered with the state police to start the investigatory part of it, so it's meeting with them and setting up headquarters for them to work at an emergency operations center. So those are the real practical things that you know, leaders have one foot in where you are today and one foot hopefully in where you're going tomorrow. Part of the challenge that I had locally was, how do I manage all this traffic? So we were inundated with so much, mostly media, but also people that just wanted to come and look and see, where did this thing happen? So it's, you know, working with mutual aid police departments to come and help manage our traffic. Getting those big, you know, those big alert things that you see on highways that direct people to take alternate routes, and businesses that had to close because the traffic glut was so impactful that the businesses couldn't open. So then working with the state legislature, starting with immediately that following Monday, working with legislators to say, okay, I'm going to need a lot of resources here. I'm going to need some help in terms of people as well as money. I'm going to have to start getting some things in place to start saving the businesses that were being so impacted. So that's what my days were like.
My days were spent trying to plan 10 funerals, wakes, all within 6 days. That next day we organized our parish team, and we went from home to sit with families and to talk a little bit about the nature of the service. Because we had this pressure on us that Christmas was coming, these funerals had to take place. And plus, the media crush was absolutely unbelievable. I mean, there was constant requests for interviews from international as well as national. I also had to deal with a whole weekend of liturgies, and trying to come up with a homily or a sermon that would make some kind of sense to the general community of what we were going through. So I agree with Pat, there was no next day. It just kept rolling into more and more and more until we actually got to that end game, which was, for me, on Christmas.
Well, I'd have to agree with him. It was a little bit of a surreal sort of experience following that. It was about determining what are the stories that we're going to put into the special edition, how are we going to reach out to people, who can we reach out to, and even for us, dealing with the national, worldwide media. I mean, at our doorstep, wanting to interview the bee. And we were just doing our job. We're just reporting on what's happening in our town. We had to determine on the spot, who do we talk to, who do we not talk to? And overall, we generally don't give interviews because our job is not to be the news, but to report the news. So keeping all of that straight, and it was just, everybody was so focused. I can't tell you, every single person there was so focused on getting the stories that had to get out to the readers on time. And then every day, like Pat said, was just a kind of a continuation of that. We just went to our work, did our jobs, went to work, did our jobs, went home, cried, came back. You know, it's a very, very surreal experience. And I hope that none of you ever have to experience something like that, but I hope that when you do, you know that you can do it. You can do it.